A flight is cruising smoothly until a crying child asks for water and the flight attendant refuses to help. Just 8 minutes later, she's fired in front of everyone. What could have led to such a dramatic turn? Stick around to find out what happened. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a regular morning flight from Atlanta to New York. The cabin was full, the air was warm, and the chatter of passengers settling in filled the atmosphere. Everything seemed normal, but there was one sound that stood out: a child crying loudly from the middle of the plane. A mother, seated with her son, was trying to calm him down, but nothing seemed to work. The little boy, probably no older than 3, was sobbing uncontrollably, his tears streaking down his face. The mother, clearly distressed, whispered calming words to him, but the child's cries only grew louder. People around them started to shift uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances, though no one said anything. It wasn't uncommon for young children to cry during flights, but the noise was starting to get to everyone. Not far from them, a flight attendant named Clara, who had been walking down the aisle with a tray of drinks, noticed the situation. She didn't seem to be in a hurry, just moving at a steady pace. The mother, hoping to ease her child's discomfort, reached up to Clara as she passed, asking for some water. She explained that her son hadn't stopped crying for the past 15 minutes, and she just needed a little water to calm him down. But instead of offering help, Clara gave the mother a cold, almost dismissive look. She paused, then said, "I can't give you any water right now. You'll need to wait until the seatbelt sign goes off." The mother was taken aback. She could hardly believe her ears. "But he's so thirsty. He's been crying the whole time," the mother pleaded. Clara, without much sympathy, simply repeated the same line. "It's the rules. Wait until we reach cruising altitude. I can't do anything until then." The mother didn't know what to say. She tried to console her son, but her heart was sinking. The other passengers, who had heard the exchange, began to look uncomfortable, some even muttering to one another under their breath. The situation was escalating, but Clara didn't seem to notice. The child's sobs continued, echoing through the cabin, making the air feel even heavier than it already was. Everyone was just waiting for the tension to ease, but it wasn't going to happen. Not yet. As the minutes passed, the tension in the cabin only grew. The mother, still holding her crying son, seemed at a loss. She gently rocked him in her arms, whispering in his ear, but it wasn't enough. The boy's sobs became more frantic, his small hands gripping tightly to her shirt. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers began shifting in their seats, their discomfort growing with every minute. A few tried to ignore the sound, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Some passengers even started checking their watches, as if hoping the child's cries would eventually stop on their own. Clara, the flight attendant, continued her rounds. She moved down the aisle, handing out drinks and snacks to the other passengers without a second glance at the mother and her child. But it wasn't just the mother who was feeling the heat. Other passengers, especially those seated nearby, were visibly irritated by the noise. One man in his 50s, seated a few rows ahead of the mother, was growing increasingly frustrated. He glanced back over his shoulder a few times, trying to block out the sound with his headphones, but it wasn't working. Finally, he took off his headphones and stood up, slowly making his way down the aisle. He stopped beside Clara, who was busy chatting with another passenger. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice steady but firm. "Can you please do something about that child? It's been going on for a while now." Clara gave him a brief look but didn't stop what she was doing. "Sir, I'm aware," she replied, almost as though she were annoyed by his interruption. "I'm handling it." The man didn't seem satisfied with that response. "You're handling it? How? By ignoring it?" His tone was sharper now. Clara turned to face him, raising an eyebrow. "Sir, I told you, it's the rules. We have to wait until we reach cruising altitude." Her voice was colder than before, but the man wasn't backing down. "That's not good enough," he said. "That child is in distress. A little water won't hurt, will it?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "I told you, I can't do anything right now. Please take your seat, sir. The man looked at her for a long moment, disbelief written across his face. Without another word, he returned to his seat, but not before glaring at Clara. The other passengers around them were starting to whisper. A few of them exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with the man's frustration. There was a growing sense that things were getting out of hand. People were starting to wonder, why wasn't anyone doing something to help the mother and child? The flight attendant's cold response seemed to have done little to settle the discomfort in the cabin. The child's crying had become relentless, and the mother was visibly distraught. She tried everything, shushing him softly, bouncing him gently in her arms, even wiping his tear-streaked face with a napkin. But nothing worked. It was clear that both mother and child were in distress. A few more passengers, unable to ignore the situation any longer, exchanged frustrated glances. Some of them were staring at Clara, waiting for her to do something, anything, to help ease the situation. It wasn't long before the situation reached a boiling point. As the cries echoed through the cabin, Clara could feel the weight of the disapproving stares on her back. She was still walking up and down the aisle, serving drinks to other passengers as if nothing were happening. The hum of the airplane's engines was the only sound louder than the child's cries, and even that seemed to be drowned out by the growing tension in the cabin. At that moment, a voice from the back of the plane broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to catch Clara's attention. "Excuse me," a woman's voice called out. "Can you please help that poor mother?" Clara looked up, momentarily taken aback. It wasn't often that passengers directly confronted her about her duties. She turned around and saw a woman standing at the back of the plane, her arms crossed in frustration. "I've been listening to that poor child cry for the past 20 minutes, the woman continued, her tone sharp but not angry. "It's obvious she needs help. Is there really no way you can offer a little water?" Clara paused, clearly irritated by the interruption. But there was no avoiding it now. More passengers had started to take notice, and the woman's words seemed to echo the growing dissatisfaction around her. Clara cleared her throat and gave a tight smile. "As I've told everyone, there are rules to follow," she said, the same cold tone creeping into her voice. The woman shook her head. "Rules? The child is crying, the mother is upset, and you're just standing there like nothing's wrong." She stepped closer to Clara, her voice rising just a bit. "It's a basic request, for goodness sake. A little water would calm him down. You can't tell me that's against any protocol." The confrontation didn't end there. More people began speaking up, with murmurs of agreement spreading throughout the cabin. Some passengers who had kept their heads down before were now openly discussing the situation. "What's the harm in giving a glass of water?" one man whispered to his seatmate. Another woman added, "It's just cruel to ignore it like that. The child's obviously in distress." Clara's eyes flickered across the cabin. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her. The pressure was building, and though she didn't show it outwardly, she was beginning to feel cornered. Still, she remained firm, repeating the same lines. "We have rules to follow, and I can't make exceptions. Please return to your seats." But now it was too late. The situation had moved beyond a simple request for water. The passengers were no longer just annoyed. They were upset. And they were beginning to expect Clara to do something, anything, to resolve the situation. But she didn't. And that's when the first signs of what was to come started to show. The feeling of unease in the air wasn't just because of the child's crying. It was because Clara had stopped caring. At least that's how it seemed to everyone else. The tension in the cabin was becoming unbearable. It was as if the atmosphere had thickened, and the crying child, though still loud, seemed almost drowned out by the increasing discomfort of the passengers. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, some form of resolution. But it didn't seem like Clara was about to change her stance. The mother, who had been trying her best to calm her son, was now visibly exhausted. Her shoulders were slumped, and her face was pale with frustration. She looked over at the flight attendant, who was continuing her duties without any sign of concern. Clara had just finished serving a passenger a drink when another person, a man in his late 30s seated a few rows ahead of the crying child, stood up. His face was stern, and his eyes were fixed on Clara as he walked down the aisle toward her. There was something different in his step now, something more forceful. This wasn't a casual comment or a simple complaint. He was ready to take action. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying across the cabin as he approached. Clara looked up, her expression as indifferent as ever. "Is there any reason why you're refusing to help that woman?" he asked bluntly. The entire aisle seemed to go silent as the passengers turned their attention to the exchange. Clara didn't flinch. "I've already told everyone the rules are clear. I can't give out any water until we reach cruising altitude," she repeated almost robotically. The man shook his head. "I'm sorry, but that's not good enough," he said. "I'm sitting right here and I've watched this entire ordeal unfold. That child is in distress and you're doing nothing to help." He lowered his voice slightly but still spoke with authority. "You're in charge of this cabin, aren't you? It's your job to ensure that everyone is comfortable, not just follow rules that don't make sense." For a brief moment, Clara hesitated. It was clear the pressure was starting to get to her, but she quickly recovered, raising her chin slightly and maintaining her cool exterior. "Sir, I don't need a lecture. I'm following the company's guidelines and I expect you to respect that," she said, her tone growing sharper. The man, however, wasn't backing down. "Respect? Respect would be showing some compassion. That's a child, for crying out loud. Don't you see what's happening here?" He gestured toward the mother, who was trying to comfort her son but was clearly at her wit's end. "You can't hide behind rules when the situation clearly calls for common sense." By now, the entire cabin seemed to be holding its breath. The silence that had descended upon the passengers was deafening. Some were nodding in agreement with the man. Others were looking at Clara, waiting for her response. The mother, still holding her crying child, looked up at Clara with pleading eyes. But Clara refused to make eye contact. Instead, she simply glanced at the clock on the wall, signaling that the plane was still not at cruising altitude. It was at this point that a couple of passengers, who had been quietly watching from their seats, began to whisper among themselves. "She's just standing there. Why doesn't she do something?" One whispered to another. Another passenger added, "I can't believe she's letting that child suffer just because of some rule." The tension was building to a breaking point. The mother had begun to tear up herself now, helplessly looking at her child and then back at Clara. Her hands were trembling, and it was clear that she didn't know what to do anymore. The child's crying had reached a near hysterical pitch. It was clear that this wasn't just about water anymore. It was about the flight attendant's refusal to listen, to show any empathy or understanding. And for the passengers who had been patiently sitting by, it was now about standing up for what was right. Clara, sensing the shift in the air, looked around the cabin. The murmurs had turned into whispers, and the whispers into outright criticism. She could feel the eyes of the entire plane on her now. But instead of responding with any sense of urgency, she did what she had done all along. She turned and walked down the aisle, as though nothing had happened. But in that moment, something changed. The passengers were no longer simply waiting for the flight to reach cruising altitude. They were waiting for a resolution, and the clock was ticking. As Clara moved away, the air in the cabin remained thick with tension. The whispers continued to circulate, growing louder, fueled by the frustration of passengers who felt helpless in the face of the situation. The mother, now looking completely drained, was still holding her son, who was clearly growing more exhausted by the minute. Her efforts to console him had failed, and her face was flushed with the kind of helplessness only a parent in distress could understand. The passengers around her couldn't help but notice her struggle. A few exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. One woman, a few rows ahead, leaned toward her friend and quietly said, "It's unbelievable. No one is doing anything to help that child." The flight attendant, Clara, had just passed by again, this time on her way back down the aisle, but her gaze never shifted toward the mother and child. The passengers watched her, hoping she would reconsider, but she didn't even slow down. Her focus was entirely on the duties she'd been trained to perform, and nothing, it seemed, would break her rigid adherence to the rules. But as the cries of the child continued, something shifted among the passengers. They could feel the injustice of it all. The mother's face was etched with exhaustion, her shoulders hunched in defeat. No one knew exactly what to do, but one thing became clear. This wasn't going to end until someone took action. Then it happened. An elderly man seated at the back of the plane stood up slowly. He wasn't tall, but his presence was commanding. He shuffled down the aisle with purpose, his cane tapping softly against the floor. The murmurs grew quieter as he passed, and by the time he reached the front of the cabin, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Clara was just finishing another service round when she noticed the man standing in front of her. His face was stern, his posture straight, and there was a quiet determination in his eyes. Without waiting for her to speak, he addressed her calmly, but firmly. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, his voice carrying in the silence of the cabin. "You can't just ignore a child in distress like that." Clara blinked, a bit taken aback by his directness. "Sir, I've already explained." "I don't care about your explanation," the man interrupted, his voice unwavering. "That child needs help. Now." The passengers watched in silence as the elderly man stood his ground, unwavering in his belief that something needed to be done. Clara's eyes flicked nervously around the cabin, where eyes were now fixed on her. She could feel the weight of their expectations, but she still clung to her role. "I'm following protocol," she said, her voice quieter now, almost defensive. "I can't give water until we're at cruising altitude." The elderly man shook his head slowly. "Protocol is meant to protect people, not punish them," he said softly but firmly. "That poor mother is doing everything she can to calm her son, and you're standing here, doing nothing. You've seen it for yourself. This isn't about rules, it's about common decency." For a moment, Clara stood still, her jaw tightening. She wanted to say something, to defend her actions, but the words wouldn't come. The pressure from the passengers, the disapproving stares, and the elderly man's steady gaze all seemed to weigh heavily on her. She could feel the heat of their judgment. It wasn't just one person anymore, it was the entire plane. The mother's distress had become everyone's concern, and the flight attendant's refusal to act had begun to shift from an isolated mistake to something more significant. The man's words seemed to linger in the air, and Clara realized, perhaps for the first time, that she wasn't in control of the situation anymore. The elderly man stood there, waiting for some kind of response, but Clara had no answer. Instead, she quickly turned away and started to walk back down the aisle, avoiding the gaze of the passengers. It was clear now that something was going to happen, but what? No one knew yet. As Clara walked away, the tension in the cabin was almost suffocating. The elderly man remained standing, his cane still firmly planted in front of him, as if he were unwilling to move until something changed. His words had hung in the air like a challenge, and no one in the cabin could ignore them. The passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances, waiting to see what would happen next. But nothing did, at least not immediately. Clara didn't stop to reconsider. She simply kept moving down the aisle, her eyes straight ahead, her face a mask of professionalism. But there was something different now. The whispers had grown louder, and the murmurs of discontent were spreading through the plane like wildfire. It wasn't just about the crying child anymore. It was about something bigger. Passengers were beginning to realize that what they were witnessing wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a moment where someone had refused to act when they clearly could have, and that refusal was starting to feel like a betrayal. For the mother, the situation was growing unbearable. She had stopped trying to calm her son, her hands limp at her sides as the child's cries continued to echo through the cabin. Her face was streaked with tears, and she stared down at her son, unable to do anything to help him. The helplessness in her eyes was unmistakable. She had hoped for so long that someone, anyone, would step in. But now, with the flight attendant so determined to follow her rules, it felt like there was no way out. The other passengers could see it too. They saw her defeat. Finally, someone else spoke up. A middle-aged woman seated just across the aisle from the mother had been watching the entire scene unfold. She had shifted in her seat several times, clearly uncomfortable, and had exchanged a few whispered comments with the people around her. But now she stood up. She didn't hesitate. She wasn't waiting for anyone else to take the first step. Without looking back, she made her way toward the front of the plane, her eyes set with a determined purpose. As she approached Clara, she said in a clear, steady voice, "Excuse me, I'm going to ask again. Why is it that we can't help that poor child? I'm a mother myself, and I can't stand to watch this anymore." Clara, who had been walking back toward the galley, paused for a second. She stopped, but she didn't face the woman immediately. The silence that followed was almost more uncomfortable than the crying child. It was clear that Clara was trying to decide whether or not to respond. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the cabin on her. The passengers were waiting for her reaction, and the woman's words hung in the air like an accusation. After what felt like an eternity, Clara finally turned to face her. Her expression was hard, but there was a flicker of something else, maybe frustration, maybe hesitation, beneath the surface. She looked at the woman and said, "I've already told you, ma'am, the rules are clear. We cannot serve anything until we're at cruising altitude." The woman didn't back down. "And how long is that going to take? Another hour?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "That child can't wait another minute. No one expects you to break the rules, but surely you can show a little compassion. I'm not asking for a 5-course meal, just a glass of water. It's not too much to ask, is it?" Clara's face hardened, but this time she didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a deep breath, as though bracing herself for something. The room seemed to quiet even more, and for the first time it was clear that the flight attendant was starting to realize the full scope of what was happening. The eyes of nearly everyone in the cabin were on her. There was no escaping it now. The mother, still holding her son, looked up at the flight attendant, her face a picture of exhaustion and silent pleading. Clara met her gaze for a brief moment, but instead of offering the water that everyone had hoped for, she simply turned away. "I'm sorry," Clara muttered, though it sounded insincere. "I can't do anything right now." It was a simple statement, but the impact was immediate. The entire cabin seemed to deflate in that instant. Some passengers sighed in disappointment. Others shook their heads. But what happened next was unexpected. The elderly man, who had been standing silently at the back of the cabin, took a step forward, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't keep hiding behind the rules," he said, his voice firm. "It's not just about following orders. It's about doing what's right. That child is crying for a reason, and the reason is clear. You can help, and you should." Clara's face reddened, but she didn't say anything. The elderly man's words hit their mark. The other passengers, one by one, started to nod in agreement. What had begun as a quiet stir of discontent had now grown into something much louder. More people were standing, more voices were rising in protest. It wasn't just a handful of passengers anymore. It was almost everyone in the cabin who had grown tired of watching this unfold. And then, something unexpected happened. The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's calm voice said, breaking through the tension. "We apologize for the delay, but we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. We ask that you remain in your seats with your seatbelt fastened for just a little longer." The captain's words hung in the air, but they did nothing to ease the growing frustration in the cabin. Clara's grip on her duties had started to slip, and the situation, which had already spiraled out of control, was quickly approaching a breaking point. Passengers were beginning to demand answers, and the flight attendant seemed powerless to stop it. With the child still crying, the mother still pleading for help, and the passengers now fully aware of the injustice unfolding in front of them, Clara's earlier confidence began to waver. It was clear that the atmosphere in the cabin had changed, and now all eyes were on her to see how this situation would end. The tension in the cabin was now palpable. The captain's voice had done nothing to calm the passengers. If anything, it had only made things worse. The promise of unexpected turbulence seemed hollow, a feeble excuse to delay the situation even further. Clara could feel the eyes of the entire plane on her, watching her every move. The voices of the passengers, once whispers of frustration, had now grown into a chorus of quiet demands and uneasy murmurs. Some passengers were standing in the aisles, their arms crossed, waiting for something to change. The quiet stares of others bore into Clara, as if they were waiting for her to finally break and do the right thing. The mother, still holding her son, looked beyond exhausted. She had tried everything to comfort her child, but nothing was working. Her once calm demeanor had completely evaporated. She wiped her tears, though it was clear there was no relief. Her hand trembled as she stroked her son's hair, trying to soothe him in a way that had long stopped working. The boy's sobs had become ragged, his little body shaking in his mother's arms. And it wasn't just the child's distress that was breaking her. It was the absolute helplessness of being ignored, of asking for something as simple as water and having it denied. Clara, on the other hand, was frozen in place. She was still standing at the front of the cabin, looking out toward the mother and child. Her face was tight, her posture rigid, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed her calm exterior, a flicker of doubt. The mounting pressure from the passengers, the elderly man's accusations, and the looks of disappointment from those around her had begun to chip away at her composure. She glanced briefly at the clock. Another 20 minutes, maybe 30, before the plane would reach cruising altitude. But at that moment, the minutes felt like hours. The hum of the airplane's engines, the quiet murmurs of the passengers, and the constant sound of the child's crying created a kind of unbearable white noise. Clara's grip on her duties was slipping, and she knew it. She had been trained to follow protocol, to stick to the rules no matter what. But what she was witnessing now was beyond what the rules could fix. She was starting to realize that. But still, she hesitated. Was she really ready to break from protocol? What would that mean for her job? What would the airline think? The voices from the passengers grew louder now, no longer whispers, but outright comments being exchanged across the aisles. "She's still not helping," one passenger said. "What kind of flight attendant refuses to do something as simple as give a little water?" another added. The elderly man, who had been quietly observing the situation from the back of the plane, couldn't stand by anymore. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the front, his cane tapping rhythmically on the floor. This time there was no hesitation in his movement. The murmurs in the cabin stilled for a moment as the man approached Clara, his eyes locked onto her. "I've been watching this whole thing, young lady," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been flying for over 40 years, and I've never seen anything like this. You're not just ignoring the mother, you're ignoring the rules of decency." Clara tried to maintain her composure, but the words hit harder than she expected. She turned to face him, her shoulders stiff, but there was no longer the same sense of authority in her stance. The man wasn't shouting, but his words cut through the air like a blade. The passengers were watching again, and this time, the silence was deafening. "You have a responsibility here," the elderly man continued. "It's not just about what's on paper, it's about what's right in front of you. That child is in pain, that mother is in distress, and you're just standing there holding on to some rule that's meant to protect people. Well, right now it's doing the opposite." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. She couldn't come up with anything to say. She had been so focused on following the rules, on doing her job as she had been trained, that she hadn't stopped to think about the human side of things. The child crying in her mother's arms, the passengers who were now voicing their discomfort, and the growing pressure of the situation. The man wasn't finished. "It's not about rules anymore. It's about compassion. You could have solved this hours ago with something as simple as a cup of water. That's all it would have taken." At this point, Clara could no longer deny it. She was trapped in her own rigidity, unable to make the decision everyone was hoping for. The passengers were no longer just voicing their frustration. They were now looking at her with disappointment, as if she had failed them. The elderly man's words hung heavy in the air, and Clara could see that the passengers were starting to turn against her. It wasn't just the crying child now, it was her refusal to act. For a moment, Clara stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. Then, as if by instinct, she glanced back at the mother. The woman's face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes red from tears. She wasn't asking for much, just a basic kindness, a small gesture. And Clara knew deep down that she had the power to make that happen. The air seemed to hold its breath as Clara slowly walked over to the galley. She didn't say anything as she reached for the small plastic cups of water, but the passengers knew what was happening. Some had begun to whisper again, though this time it was different. There was a sense of hope in the air. Clara moved back toward the mother and child. Her steps were slow, deliberate, but this time there was no hesitation. When she reached the mother, Clara held out the cup of water, her face softening for the first time all day. "Here," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I should have done this sooner." The mother, still holding her child, looked up at Clara with surprise. There was a moment of hesitation, but then the mother took the cup gratefully. She gently offered the water to her son, who, after a few sips, began to calm down. His sobs slowly turned into soft whimpers, and within moments, he was finally quiet. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. The tension in the cabin seemed to lift. The child's cries had been silenced, and so had the silent tension that had been building for so long. But while this small act of kindness had brought temporary relief, the passengers could sense something had shifted. The apology wasn't enough to erase the frustration that had built up over the past hour. Clara had given the water, yes, but the passengers knew that the real damage had already been done. Something was about to change, and they could feel it in the air. The mother, her hands shaking with gratitude, gently helped her son drink the water. His sobs had softened into little sniffles, and as he finished the last drops, he let out a small yawn, his eyelids fluttering. The change was immediate. The cabin, which had felt so heavy and tense, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The passengers, who had been watching the scene unfold with bated breath, finally began to relax. But the damage was already done. The lingering discomfort in the air wasn't about the child anymore. It was about the way the situation had unfolded, and more importantly, how it had been handled. Clara stood a few paces away, her hands still at her sides, her face a mask of uncertainty. She had done what was asked of her, but the moment felt anticlimactic. The relief of the child's quietness wasn't enough to erase the tension she had caused. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some offering slight nods of approval, but others still harboring a deep sense of disappointment. It wasn't just the simple act of giving water that had been at the heart of this ordeal. It was the time it had taken for her to act. It was the stubbornness, the rigidity with which she had adhered to the rules, when everyone in the cabin could see that compassion was needed more than protocol. And then, just as the mother settled back into her seat, holding her now peaceful child in her arms, the cabin door opened with a soft click. The senior flight supervisor, a woman in her mid-40s with a no-nonsense air about her, stepped into the cabin. She looked around quickly, taking in the situation with a glance. Her eyes locked onto Clara, and without saying a word, she made her way toward her. Clara's stomach dropped. It was as if the weight of the entire situation had shifted in that moment. She knew what was coming, even before the supervisor spoke. There was no way that a scene like this, passengers openly questioning her actions, the growing murmurs of discontent, the violation of basic customer service standards, would go unnoticed. The supervisor, who had no doubt been briefed about the escalating tensions, came to a stop in front of Clara. "I need to speak with you," the supervisor said firmly, but not unkindly. Clara nodded stiffly, her heart racing. This wasn't just a simple correction. This was a conversation about everything that had led to this moment. The supervisor turned to the passengers, offering a small, apologetic smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the situation has been difficult, and I sincerely apologize for any distress caused. I'll take it from here," she said, her voice projecting enough to be heard across the cabin. The passengers, still visibly shaken, slowly nodded, some muttering quiet words of reassurance to one another, but most of their attention was now focused on the two women at the front of the plane. Clara followed the supervisor into the galley, the door closing softly behind them. Inside, the supervisor wasted no time. Her voice, though calm, had an edge to it. "Clara, what exactly happened out there?" the supervisor asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Clara hesitated, her mind racing. I was following the protocol," she started, her words sounding hollow even to her own ears. She tried again, her voice a little stronger. "The rules are clear. I can't give out anything until we're at cruising altitude. I told her, and I told the others." The supervisor cut her off with a gentle but firm gesture. "I understand that, but you're also a human being, Clara. And sometimes what the rules tell you to do isn't what's needed in the moment. You have to read the room. You have to understand when it's okay to bend the rules in order to help people." Clara's shoulders slumped. The weight of her actions was starting to hit her. The supervisor continued, her voice softening just a touch. "You should have offered that child water. It would have taken you a few seconds, and that mother could have stopped worrying about her son for just a minute. You can't ignore the human side of things. You're not just there to serve drinks. You're there to help people." Clara nodded, though her heart felt heavy. "I know, I didn't mean to make it worse. I thought I was doing my job." The supervisor sighed and shook her head. "Your job isn't just about following rules. It's about judgment. It's about compassion. And sometimes it's about knowing when to break protocol for the greater good. This wasn't about a policy. It was about a child in pain. And you failed to see that." Clara looked down at her hands, feeling the sting of the supervisor's words. She wasn't angry with her. She knew she had messed up. She had clung to the rules, to her training, without considering the bigger picture. She had allowed herself to get caught up in the technicalities, ignoring the needs of the passengers in front of her. "There are consequences for this kind of behavior, Clara," the supervisor continued, her tone now more serious. "You've put both the airline and your colleagues in a difficult position. It's not just about one passenger or one child. It's about the message we send to everyone on this plane. You represent us. And right now, you've shown them that we're not willing to step in when we should." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. What could she say? The reality of the situation was sinking in. She had let down not just the mother and child, but the entire plane. And it wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It had become a symbol of failure. The supervisor watched her for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air before she spoke again, this time softer. "I'm not going to fire you on the spot, Clara, but I need you to understand something. This can't happen again. You need to be better than this. I expect you to reflect on what's happened and come back stronger." Clara nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. The supervisor's words were harsh, but they were deserved. She had failed, and now she would have to live with the consequences. But there was something in her that knew this wouldn't be the end. She had a chance to do better, to learn from this mistake. The supervisor gave her one last look before stepping toward the door. "I'll take over from here," she said. "You can go back to your seat, and we'll sort this out when we land. Just know that this is a turning point for you. Don't let it be your downfall." Clara didn't move immediately. She stood there for a few seconds, letting the weight of the conversation settle in. The reality of what had just happened was still crashing down on her, and she wasn't sure what the next steps would be. But she knew one thing: she couldn't afford to let this moment define her. With a final deep breath, Clara turned and walked back to her seat, her mind racing, her future uncertain. The passengers were still watching her, and though the child was now calm and the immediate crisis had passed, Clara knew that this moment would haunt her long after the plane touched down. Clara made her way back down the aisle, the weight of her supervisor's words pressing heavily on her shoulders. The cabin had quieted, but the air still felt thick, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, waiting for an answer, a resolution. or perhaps even a reckoning. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the entire cabin was watching her, even though most had returned to their own thoughts or their own distractions. The mother, now holding her son close, had finally managed to soothe him. The boy was resting his head against her shoulder, his soft breaths marking the end of his earlier cries. It was the relief that everyone had been waiting for, but somehow it felt hollow. Clara glanced at the mother for a brief moment, but the woman didn't look up. Her eyes were focused entirely on her child, who had finally found some peace. The silence was different now. Lighter, yes, but still tinged with the echoes of what had just happened. As Clara returned to her seat, she could hear snippets of conversation from passengers. Low voices, hushed tones, and muttered words that made it clear the tension hadn't fully dissipated. "I can't believe she didn't help sooner," one woman whispered to her seatmate. "She had to be told more than once." Another passenger replied, shaking his head in disbelief. "I just don't understand how she didn't get it." Clara could feel the heat of their words, even if they weren't directed at her specifically. They didn't need to be. She knew exactly what they were talking about. The air had changed. The passengers' trust had been shattered, and it was clear that no matter what happened next, she wouldn't be able to just erase the experience from their minds. She sat down slowly in her assigned seat, looking out the window, but her eyes were unfocused. The flight seemed to stretch on, each minute feeling like an eternity. What had started as a normal day had turned into something she would never forget. She had been tested, and she had failed, not just in her duties as a flight attendant, but in the way she had responded to human need. Her mind kept returning to the same thought. Why had she waited so long to act? She had been so focused on the rules, on the structure of her job, that she had lost sight of the simple human aspect of her role. She wasn't just there to follow a manual. She was there to serve, to comfort, to assist. She had allowed the child's cries, the mother's distress, and the growing discontent of the passengers to be drowned out by the rigid walls of protocol. The truth was, Clara wasn't sure what she had been afraid of. Was she afraid of getting in trouble? Of doing something that could be seen as wrong? Or had she convinced herself that her duty to follow procedure was more important than alleviating the pain of a mother and her child? Her stomach twisted as she thought about the passengers' reactions. The disappointment had been palpable, and she couldn't deny that she had failed them. But more than that, she had failed herself. This wasn't just about following the rules. It was about showing empathy, understanding, and doing the right thing in the moment. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to block out the voices around her. The steady hum of the airplane's engines filled the background, but it did little to quiet her mind. In the far corner of the cabin, she could still see the elderly man who had spoken up earlier, now sitting quietly in his seat. He was looking out the window, his face unreadable. Was he satisfied that the child had been given water? Or was he still holding on to the anger of the situation? Clara let out a slow, shaky breath. It's not over yet, she thought. There's still more to come. The supervisor hadn't said much about what would happen next, but Clara knew this wasn't something that would just blow over. There would be consequences. She could already feel the weight of them hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. She had no idea what those consequences might be, but she knew that the look on the supervisor's face told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This was a breach of trust. The plane continued to glide through the sky, the hum of the engines the only sound filling the space between Clara and the rest of the passengers. She couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for things to return to normal. For her, for the passengers, and for the mother and child. Would the mother even remember this moment when she landed? Would she share the story with others, painting Clara as the villain? Or would she simply move on, relieved that her son was okay? Clara didn't know. She only knew that she would never forget. And then there was the other side of it, the passengers who had witnessed everything. They were the silent witnesses to this tiny drama. Their disapproval was unmistakable, and the quiet murmurs that had followed Clara back to her seat had cemented the reality. They had seen her failure. She had lost their trust. That was the hardest part to accept. A flight attendant's role wasn't just about serving drinks or making sure everyone was seated properly. It was about making people feel safe, comfortable, and cared for, especially when they were at their most vulnerable. And Clara knew, deep down, that she had fallen short. It wasn't just about the water. It wasn't just about the crying child. It was about something far deeper, the responsibility that came with being in a position to help, and the failure to do so when it mattered most. Clara sat there, lost in her thoughts, as the plane continued its journey to its destination. She didn't know what would happen once they landed, whether she would be called into the supervisor's office, whether there would be disciplinary action, or whether she would simply be asked to move forward and learn from her mistake. But one thing was certain: this was a turning point for her. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could learn from it. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. As the plane began its descent, Clara felt a pang of regret, but also a flicker of resolve. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future, and whatever the consequences, she would face them head-on, knowing that she had learned a valuable lesson in compassion, one that would stay with her long after the plane had landed. The descent was slow and steady, the plane cutting through the clouds as it made its way toward the runway. Clara could feel the slight shift in pressure as the aircraft adjusted its altitude, the familiar hum of the engines vibrating beneath her feet. But today, that hum felt different. Today, it wasn't the comforting sound of routine. Today, it was a constant reminder of the situation she had just been through, of the moment that had unfolded in front of her and everyone on board. The plane was almost there, and so was Clara's confrontation with reality. She still couldn't shake the image of the mother, holding her now quiet son in her arms, her tired face slightly hidden behind the child's head. Clara had seen it. The exhaustion, the vulnerability, the sheer relief that had washed over the woman once her child had finally stopped crying. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about a mother's need for support, her desperation to help her son, and the flight attendant who had stood by and done nothing until it was too late. Clara had hoped that giving the water, though late, might somehow undo the tension, but she knew it couldn't. It was more than the act of kindness. It was the failure to recognize a mother's need when it first arose. And that was the hardest part to swallow. As the wheels of the plane began their gradual descent toward the runway, Clara's mind raced. What would happen when they landed? Would she be asked to step off the plane and face consequences immediately? Or would the reprimanding wait until after the passengers had disembarked? The thought of facing them again, of seeing the disappointed eyes of those passengers who had witnessed her failure, made her stomach turn. She had tried so hard to follow the rules, to stay within the confines of protocol, but all of that seemed meaningless now. All that mattered was the harm she had caused by sticking to the rules when empathy and compassion had been needed instead. The seatbelt sign blinked on as the plane descended further, and passengers began to stir, shifting in their seats and preparing for the landing. Clara's mind was elsewhere, her hand still resting on her lap, her fingers clenched together tightly. It was as though the rest of the world had faded into the background. The cabin was quiet, save for the gentle whir of the plane's descent and the soft sounds of passengers gathering their things. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the passengers who had been witnesses to the scene. Some of them were now reading their books, others were staring out the window, and a few were still talking in low tones, though their conversation had quieted in the face of the growing anticipation of the flight's end. There was a palpable sense of finality in the air, like a chapter closing. But Clara couldn't escape the feeling that this wasn't the end for her. Not yet, anyway. In her peripheral vision, she could see the elderly man who had spoken out earlier. He was sitting quietly, his eyes closed as if he had somehow managed to let go of the tension that had gripped everyone else. Clara couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Was he satisfied that the situation had been addressed? Or was he still holding on to the anger he'd felt for the way things had been handled? She wasn't sure, but something about the way he was sitting there, so calm and still, made her realize that he was one of the few passengers who had actually voiced his thoughts. And in a way, he had been the catalyst that pushed everything into motion. What would have happened if he hadn't spoken up? Would the child still be crying? Would the passengers still be fuming in silence? Clara didn't know, but it was a sobering thought. It had taken a stranger, someone who had no personal connection to the mother or child, to stand up and demand that something be done. Why hadn't she acted sooner? Why hadn't she recognized that something needed to change? The answers felt elusive, buried beneath the weight of her pride and her fear of stepping outside the boundaries of what she had been taught. She had been afraid to make the wrong choice, to act without permission, but now, in hindsight, it seemed clear. She had missed the most important part of her job, the ability to see beyond the rules, to read the room, and to respond in a way that reflected humanity, not just protocol. The plane was getting closer to the runway, the ground now visible beneath the thin layer of clouds. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the anticipation of landing blending with the anxiety of what was to come. She wasn't sure what would happen after the plane landed. The supervisor had said she would sort it out once they arrived, but Clara could sense that the consequences weren't going to be simple. There was no escaping the reality of what she had done, or rather, what she had failed to do. As the plane touched down with a soft thud, Clara felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, and the familiar sound of the plane slowing down was almost comforting. But there was no escaping the inevitable. She knew the passengers would be disembarking soon, and that meant the supervisor would have to confront her. She didn't want to face that conversation, but she knew she had to. It was the only way forward. The seatbelt sign turned off, and the passengers slowly began gathering their things. The soft rustle of jackets and bags filled the air, but Clara remained in her seat, motionless. She felt an intense heaviness, as though the weight of the entire plane's expectations was bearing down on her. The supervisor came into the aisle, walking slowly toward her. Clara's stomach clenched at the sight of her, the stern look still present on her face. The supervisor stopped in front of her, her eyes meeting Clara's. There was a long moment of silence before she spoke. "Clara," she said softly, but with a firmness that was impossible to ignore. "We'll have a conversation once the passengers are off the plane, but don't think for a second that you've escaped this. It's time to face the consequences of your actions." Clara nodded, her throat tightening. She wasn't sure what to say. There was nothing she could say. She had already failed, and the consequences were coming whether she was ready or not. As the passengers began to exit the plane, Clara remained seated, her gaze fixed ahead. She could hear their voices as they passed by, the low hum of their conversations blending with the sound of footsteps on the metal flooring. The silence between her and the supervisor was thick, but Clara didn't break it. She knew that what came next would be a moment of reckoning, one that would define her not just as a flight attendant but as a person. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could face the consequences and learn from them. The only question now was how she would move forward, and if she could ever regain the trust of the passengers who had witnessed her failure. The last few passengers filed off the plane, some of them offering the occasional glance toward Clara, but none of them stopped to say anything. It was as if the entire cabin was ready to move on, to put this strange and uncomfortable moment behind them. Yet Clara couldn't escape it. She could still hear the murmurs from the passengers as they walked past her, the whispers of judgment and disappointment lingering in the air, even as the doors of the plane finally closed behind them. It felt like a weight that would never quite lift. The supervisor stood nearby, her arms folded, watching Clara carefully as the cabin cleared. Clara remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ground. The sound of the overhead bins being opened and closed seemed distant now, but it was just a prelude to what was coming next. The supervisor hadn't spoken since her last words, and the silence between them grew louder with each passing second. Clara was exhausted. She was emotionally drained, But it wasn't just the weight of the day's events that was wearing her down. It was the crushing realization that she had made a mistake that she couldn't undo. She had let her fear and her rigidity blind her to the most basic need of a child and a mother in distress. She had chosen the rules over empathy, and now she was about to pay the price. Finally, the supervisor moved toward her, her footsteps steady and deliberate. "Let's go," she said quietly, her voice cool but not unkind. Clara stood up slowly, following the supervisor down the aisle toward the jet bridge. As they walked, Clara's mind raced. She thought back to the moment when the elderly man had stood up, the passengers who had started to murmur, the way the air had shifted. She couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if she had just acted sooner, if she had listened to the quiet voice inside her that told her something wasn't right. They reached the door, and the supervisor stopped, turning to face Clara. There was no rush now, no more passengers to tend to, and no more distractions. It was just the two of them, standing in the sterile silence of the jet bridge, the hum of the airport far in the distance. "I've already spoken to the airline's operations team," the supervisor began, her voice steady. "They've reviewed the situation, and we both know it's not ideal. This kind of mistake, this kind of misstep, can't be ignored." Clara nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Perhaps a reprimand, perhaps a chance to explain herself. But the supervisor's calm demeanor was hard to read. Was she angry, disappointed, or was she just doing her job, preparing for the inevitable? "You've worked here long enough to know that what happened today is serious," the supervisor continued. "You violated not just the company's protocol, but the trust of your passengers. A flight attendant's primary job is to ensure the safety and comfort of passengers, and that means knowing when to bend the rules to help people. It means knowing when compassion outweighs procedure." Clara swallowed, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She had heard the same thing before, back in her training, how being a flight attendant wasn't just about serving drinks and snacks, how it was about creating a safe environment where passengers felt cared for. She had believed it truly, but today she had failed at that. She had let her training and her desire to do everything right blind her to the situation unfolding in front of her. I understand," Clara said, her voice shaky. "I made a mistake. I know that." The supervisor looked at her for a long moment, her gaze assessing but not judgmental. "I don't think you're a bad person, Clara. In fact, you've been a good flight attendant for a long time. But you've got to learn from this. This isn't just about following rules. It's about knowing when the rules don't apply." Clara nodded again, her stomach in knots. She felt a deep sense of shame, but at the same time, there was a small glimmer of understanding. She had been so fixated on the rules, on what she had been taught, that she had failed to see the human side of the job. It wasn't just about the water. It was about the simple act of noticing someone in need, of responding with empathy. And that was something she had overlooked. "I'm going to have to write this up," the supervisor said, her tone firm but still calm. "There will be a formal review. It's standard protocol, but you'll be able to learn from this. We'll work with you to make sure this doesn't happen again." Clara's heart sank. She had known the review was coming. She had known there would be consequences, and though she understood why, the weight of it was still hard to bear. Being a flight attendant had always felt like a privilege, something she had worked hard for, something she had built her career on. But now she was faced with the very real possibility that her career could be affected by a single decision. But the supervisor's next words gave her a moment of relief. "This won't necessarily result in termination, Clara, but it will mean a period of reflection. And if you're serious about staying in this job, about being the kind of flight attendant I know you can be, then you need to show us that you've learned from this. You'll be on probation for the next few weeks, and I'll be checking in regularly to see how you're progressing. This is your chance to prove that you're ready to make things right." Clara's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the weight of the situation still lingered. She had expected worse, but at least there was a chance, an opportunity to redeem herself, to prove that she could be the flight attendant the passengers deserved. The fear of losing everything wasn't gone, but it had lessened. She had a chance to fix this. "I'll do whatever it takes," Clara said quietly, her voice steady now. "I'll learn. I won't make this mistake again." The supervisor studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good. That's what I want to hear. Now, let's get off this plane. You've got some work to do." Clara nodded and followed her out of the jet bridge, the airport's fluorescent lights blurring in the distance. The world outside was moving on, but for Clara, everything had changed. She had learned a hard lesson, one that would stay with her forever. It wasn't about following the rules. It was about knowing when to break them, when to do what was right, not just what was expected. As they walked toward the staff area, Clara felt a strange mixture of regret and determination. She had failed, yes, but she wasn't going to let that failure define her. This was a turning point, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only road she could walk now. The airport terminal was bustling with activity, the sounds of rolling suitcases and announcements over the intercom filling the air. But for Clara, it all felt distant, almost muffled. She walked alongside the supervisor, her mind still reeling from the conversation, the weight of everything that had happened hanging over her like a heavy cloud. She felt like a spectator in her own life, moving through the motions, yet disconnected from everything around her. They walked in silence for a few moments, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the hallway as they approached the staff office. Clara's heart was still pounding, but now it wasn't from fear of what might happen. It was from the realization that she had been given a second chance. She could feel the weight of the supervisor's words, that she wasn't being fired, that there was still hope, but it didn't make the shame of the situation any less difficult to bear. The supervisor opened the door to the staff room and gestured for Clara to enter. Clara stepped inside, and the first thing she noticed was the quiet hum of the office. The desks were mostly empty, with only a few crew members finishing up their reports. The fluorescent lights above flickered ever so slightly, casting a sterile glow on the sterile room. Clara couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a space where decisions were made, and today, the decision was about her. The supervisor took a seat behind her desk and motioned for Clara to sit across from her. Clara did, her hands still trembling slightly, though she tried her best to control it. She sat up straight, her back rigid, as if hoping to show the supervisor that she was taking this seriously, that she understood the gravity of what had just happened. "Clara," the supervisor began, her voice soft but firm. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, and I'm sure it's hard to accept what happened today. But I need you to understand something. You were given a responsibility, and you let the passengers down." Clara's eyes dropped to her lap. The words stung, but they weren't unexpected. She had known even before the supervisor had said them that the responsibility was hers. She had been the one who had failed to act in the moment, who had let the situation escalate to the point where the passengers were openly frustrated with her, but the supervisor didn't stop there. "You also let yourself down. This job isn't just about serving meals and drinks. It's about reading the room, understanding what people need, and knowing when it's time to take action. It's about more than following rules. It's about knowing when to be flexible and when to step outside the boundaries of what's written in the manual." Clara nodded, swallowing hard. She had heard those words before, but today they carried a weight she had never fully appreciated. She had always prided herself on being the perfect flight attendant, the one who followed the rules to the letter, the one who never made mistakes. But now, in the aftermath of the events on that flight, she realized how limiting that mindset had been. It wasn't enough to be perfect. She needed to be human. She needed to be compassionate, even when the rules made it hard. The supervisor continued, her voice softer now. "I've seen you handle difficult situations before, Clara. I know you have the potential to be great at this job, but you need to prove that you've learned from this experience. This is your chance to show that you can grow from this mistake, that you can be more than just someone who follows protocol. You need to step up. Learn how to balance compassion with responsibility. Clara looked up at the supervisor, her eyes welling with tears, though she quickly blinked them back. She had been trying so hard to prove herself, to show that she was capable of handling everything that came her way. But now, it wasn't about proving her competence. It was about showing that she could be vulnerable, that she could admit when she was wrong, and that she could learn from the experience. "I understand," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll do better. I won't let this happen again." The supervisor leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "I believe you, Clara, but you have to take this seriously. You'll be on probation for the next few weeks. That means no more slip-ups, no more mistakes. You need to show that you're capable of stepping up in these situations, that you can handle the responsibility that comes with this job. You'll also need to attend additional training sessions, ones focused on handling emotional and sensitive situations." Clara nodded again, the weight of the responsibility now fully settling in her chest. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The next few weeks would be a test, not just of her skills, but of her ability to reflect, grow, and change. But this was her chance to make things right. She couldn't undo what had happened on the flight, but she could ensure that it didn't define her future. "I'll prove to you that I can do this," Clara said, her voice steady now. "I'll do whatever it takes to show I've learned." The supervisor gave her a small, approving nod. "Good. That's what I want to hear. Now let's take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this, Clara. We'll help you. But you have to do the work, and you have to show us that you're capable of more than just following the rules. You're here to serve the passengers. That means you have to be adaptable, compassionate, and willing to make the tough calls when it counts." Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words settle in. She didn't know what the next few weeks would bring, or what her future at the airline would look like. But one thing was clear. This was a turning point. The only way forward was through it, and she was ready to face the challenge. The supervisor stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "All right, you can go for now. We'll check in with you soon. Just remember what we've discussed today. I'm confident you'll be able to turn this around." Clara stood, offering a quiet nod. She turned to walk toward the door, her heart still heavy but with a glimmer of hope. She had been given a second chance, a lifeline. It was up to her to make the most of it. As she walked out of the office and back into the noisy terminal, Clara felt a mixture of relief and determination. The world around her hadn't stopped. People were still rushing to their gates, still talking, still moving forward with their lives. But for Clara, everything had shifted. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was someone who had to learn from her mistakes, someone who had to face the consequences and prove that she could be better. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Clara knew this much. She would walk it with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. The hardest lesson had been learned, and now it was time to move forward. The days following Clara's meeting with her supervisor felt like a blur. She had been placed on probation, a weighty reminder that her actions had consequences, and each day brought a mix of self-doubt and resolve. The additional training sessions she had to attend were challenging, focusing on emotional intelligence, customer service under pressure, and conflict resolution. But Clara embraced them. Every lesson, every role-playing exercise was a small step toward redeeming herself. At first, it was hard to shake the memory of the passengers' disapproving looks, the elderly man's stern words, the frustration she had seen on the faces of people who had expected more from her. But as time went on, those images began to fade, replaced by the work she was doing to improve. Clara spent extra hours reviewing her notes, shadowing other senior attendants, and even asking passengers for feedback when appropriate. She was determined to show that she could be better, that she was capable of more than just following protocol. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she felt the old fear creeping back in, the fear of making mistakes, the fear of not being enough. But each time Clara reminded herself of the lesson she had learned. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, compassionate, and willing to learn. One morning, just a few weeks into her probation, Clara found herself back on a flight. The familiar sounds of the cabin, the rustling of seatbelts, the chime of the overhead compartments being opened, felt different now. This time she wasn't just going through the motions, she was actively engaged, checking in with passengers, scanning the cabin, ready to address whatever came her way. She had learned to read the room, to understand the needs of the people around her. It wasn't enough to just serve drinks and snacks anymore. She had to serve her passengers with care. The flight was smooth at first, but then, as the seatbelt sign lit up, Clara noticed a young family seated near the back. The little boy was fidgeting in his seat, his face scrunched up in discomfort. The mother was trying to calm him, but he was clearly upset. Clara hesitated for a split second, but then remembered the lesson she had learned so painfully. Without thinking twice, she made her way to their row. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone warm, not rushed. The mother gave her a tired smile, but there was clear concern in her eyes. "He's not feeling well," she explained softly. "He's been a bit queasy." Clara nodded. "I'll get you some water and a cold towel. Just a moment." She moved swiftly, gathering the necessary items and returning to their seat with a calm demeanor. The boy's eyes widened as she approached, and Clara gently handed him the cold towel. The mother whispered a quick thanks, and Clara could see the relief in her eyes as her son seemed to settle a little. As she walked back down the aisle, Clara felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced before. It was a small act, but it was one that mattered. The boy wasn't crying, the mother was less stressed, and Clara had stepped in to help before things escalated. This time, she had read the situation right, and it felt right. As the flight continued, Clara remained attentive, moving through the cabin with purpose. Every interaction, every moment of service was now more than just a task to complete. It was an opportunity to connect with the passengers, to make them feel heard and cared for. She wasn't just doing her job, she was doing it with heart. The flight landed without incident, and as Clara helped the passengers disembark, she noticed a few of them offering small nods of approval. A few even gave her a smile, one that felt genuine, like they had appreciated the extra effort she had made. It was a far cry from the looks of disappointment she had once received. Later that day, Clara met with her supervisor for her probation review. She sat in the same office, but this time the atmosphere felt different. She wasn't filled with dread. She was nervous, yes, but it was a nervousness that came with the hope of a fresh start. She had worked hard to get here, and she knew this was the moment that would determine whether she had truly turned the corner. The supervisor looked up from her notes as Clara entered. She gave her a small smile, one that carried a sense of approval. "Clara," she said, setting her papers aside, "I've been monitoring your progress over the past few weeks, and I've got to say I'm impressed." Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. "I've been working hard to learn from my mistake." The supervisor nodded. "I can see that. You've shown real growth. Your interactions with passengers have been more thoughtful, and you've been proactive in handling situations before they escalate. Most importantly, you've learned the value of empathy. You've learned that sometimes the rules can't provide all the answers. It's about knowing when to go beyond the manual and be a human being." Clara felt a rush of relief. The weight she had carried for so long seemed to lift just a little. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but full of gratitude. "I've learned a lot from this experience, and I'll keep working hard to make sure I never make the same mistake again." The supervisor smiled, this time with a bit more warmth. "I believe you. You've passed your probation, Clara. You're back on track. But remember, this is an ongoing journey. Every day is an opportunity to improve, to connect, and to serve." Clara stood, her heart light, her mind clear. She wasn't just walking out of the office a flight attendant. She was someone who had learned one of the most valuable lessons of her career, that the best flight attendants don't just follow the rules. They understand the people they serve. They know when to listen, when to act, and when to offer a kind word or a simple gesture to make a passenger's day a little bit better. As she left the office and headed back into the terminal, Clara knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But this time, she was ready. She had the tools, the perspective, and the heart to face whatever came her way. And for the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself to smile. She had learned, and in that moment, she felt like she had truly earned the right to wear the uniform. Her journey as a flight attendant had just begun. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.